Hello, this is Book Project Part 1. Let's start by explaining the application's architecture a bit. Microservice architecture is an architectural style that structures an application as a collection of services. These services are deployed independently, loosely coupled, organized according to business capabilities, and a small team holds the responsibility. What really matters is creating a solid service architecture. This means figuring out the different services, what they do, and how they work together. If this isn't done well, there's a chance it could end up causing slow software delivery by creating a scattered and complex system. I will continue with an architectural example for a simple book application. I am trying to keep the project as simple as possible so we can focus mostly on the concepts we want to explore. As you can see in our architecture, we'll have three services: Book Library Service, Users List Service, and Notification Service. Each service uses its own database in order to ensure autonomy of each service. This is an important aspect of the microservice architecture to not create dependencies. In this session, we'll start to create the Book Library Service. The interface used for this service is a REST API. Keep in mind that there are other interfaces for microservices which we will explore later in other sessions. Now let's open Visual Studio. Create a new project. Select Class Library Project to create our book solution. Click Next. I use .NET 7 version for this project. Now we'll clean up a bit this project. We don't need the auto-generated class 1 and add 3 folders for this solution. The first one we will name it GUI. Second one will be Services. And third one Common. Now we will add our first service, Book Services. Right-click Add New Project. We'll select ASP.NET Core Web API and click Next. So we'll name it Book Services and keep the default configuration. Here we will have to also clean a bit our web API. So delete weather forecast. This class was auto-generated as an example, and weather forecast controller. First, we'll add our two entities for this project, book and author. Right-click on Book Service and add a new folder. We'll name it Entities. Right-click, add a new class. First class, we'll call it Book. And the second class, Author. Head back to the Book class. We will have to add the following properties: ID, name, year published, and a collection of authors, in case the book has more than one author. Back to the Author class, and here we add ID, author name, and a collection of books. A single author can write multiple books as well. Let's set up our DB context. Right-click on the project and add new folder, DB context. Before we proceed with our DB context implementation, we need to add a few NuGet packages. So right-click on Dependencies and go to Manage NuGet Packages. Here we will select Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design and install. And also search for Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQLite and click Install. And one more for SQL Server. Now add a new folder, DI registries, which will be used later for dependency injection registry. And go back to dbContext and add our dbContext class. We'll call it BookDbContext. Here the class will inherit from the dbContext. dbContext is a component of Entity Framework that lets developers work with database. It does this by creating classes that represent database tables. We establish dbSet for books and authors here, which correspond to the books and authors tables. Go to appsettings.json file to configure database connection. Here you need to add the connection string BookSQLLiteDbConnection. For SQLite database, you only add the location of the database file. For this session, you can download the SQLite database from the GitHub repository linked in the description of this video. In dbContext, the onConfiguring method is used to add database connection options. We specify that we want to use SQLite as the database provider and retrieve the connection string value from appsettings.json file. Now let's add our controller. Right-click on Controllers folder and add controller. We select API controller empty and name it Books Controller. Now, route attribute will be added by default, and it is an attribute which specifies the route template for the controller. And controller token is a placeholder that will be replaced with the controller name. We'll add the iLogger interface by injecting it via the constructor. And now let's add the get method, which will return the list of books. HTTP-GET is a routing attribute indicating that this method should be invoked when an HTTP-GET request is made to the endpoint. Now we can directly retrieve the books from our BookDB context. So let's first do that. And we will also have to inject our BookDB context via our constructor. And in order to use dependency injection on BookDB context instance, we must add the database context service to Web Host Builder's services collection. We go to Program File and add DB context service. Let's go back to Book Controller. And we'll add toList method to convert the query result into a list entities book. Now let's run this endpoint, but don't forget to set the project as a startup project. We see here we have an endpoint books. Let's run the endpoint. And now we get a list of books in JSON format, but there are no authors listed. Now go back to the code. We can, of course, add include method to include the authors, but this will give us uncyclic object error. But let's do this anyway and see the result in action. We'll run the project. And when executing the endpoint, this exception pops up. This exception appears due to a circular reference or dependency between objects. In our case, This is due to the fact that author class has a list of books and book class has a list of authors, which creates a cycle. We'll fix that by using Automapper. Search for Automapper in NuGet Gallery and install Automapper and Automapper extensions, Microsoft Dependency Injection. This is a C# library that simplifies the process of mapping data between different object models. Now let's create a folder mapper and a folder models for our model classes. Add two classes to the models folder, book model and author model. Now, the author model will only get the book ID to reference the ID of the book it belongs, but the book model will match the properties of the book entity. However, in real-world scenarios, there could be internal data that you don't want to expose to API consumers, so you can handle this by hiding some of the properties using book model class to decide which information is presented to users. Now let's create our mapper classes. We'll add a book mapper class. Which inherits profile class from Automapper library. Create a constructor and add mapping. Create map method creates a mapping configuration between the entity's book class and the book model class. ForMember is a method which is used to configure a specific mapping for a property. In this case, we are configuring the author's property. We are not finished yet with the mapping. We have to add a mapping for author's entity, which will be mapped to author class. So we'll add a class, author mapper. We'll add a constructor. And this class also inherits from profile class. Create map will create a mapping between the author model and the author entity, and we'll use ForMember method, which custom sets the book ID property from author model class to the first book's ID associated with the source entity author. Back to the controller. Here in the controller, we could also implement the mapping. So we would have to inject IMapper to the constructor, but we don't want to do that because we don't want to make the constructor too big. So I'll add a new folder, services, and I will add an interface iBook SVC and a class book SVC, which will handle the retrieving of books from the database. The interface will have one method, getBooks, and the book SVC will have to implement the interface iBook service. We add also the mapper, and we noticed here that we need to inject both the mapper and the DB context. So we do that in the constructor of the book service. And then we go back to the books controller and we'll use the book service to get the books. So we'll have to clean up a bit here. And we don't need the BookDB context anymore here, as we are using it in the book service. We'll modify the get method to use BookSVC to retrieve the books. Don't forget to change the get method to return a list of book model. Here in the controller we have injected a new BookSVC instance, and if we go in the BookSVC class we have injected a new mapper instance. That means that we need to go to program file and add BookSVC and mapper to dependency injection container. AutoMapper provides add AutoMapper method which configures AutoMapper within the application. And let's register BookSVC with a transient lifetime in the dependency injection container. We can run the project and execute the endpoint. Everything went fine and authors were also added to our output JSON. That concludes our book project first session. You'll find relevant links provided in the video description, and you can also proceed with the upcoming sessions to continue your journey with the book project. Thank you for watching.